Good evening to everyone joining us in China or elsewhere across Asia. Good afternoon to those of you here in the UK or throughout Europe. Good morning to those on the US East Coast or North American East Coast. And good very early morning to those on the West Coast, for whom, unfortunately, this is a very bad time. So today we're really lucky to welcome Professor Andrew MacDonald from Duke Qinshan University, where he's an assistant professor. He's been there since about 2018, I believe, and before that was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Louisville. Andrew completed his PhD in politics, actually DPhil in politics, from the University of Oxford. Prior to that, he did undergraduate degree in history and a master's degree in East Asian Studies at Stanford University in California. He's really established himself as a leading expert over the last decade or so on public opinion research in China and elsewhere in Asia, using surveys and also other innovative techniques to get at what sort of people are thinking in society, as well as dynamics of things online. So today's talk really combines these two strengths of his overall profile to look at how the Chinese public views online privacy in the aftermath of COVID. So I'll invite him now to speak for as long as he needs and likes about this research. And just remind everyone in the audience, you can pose questions by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll pose those to Andrew at the end of his talk so that he can answer them. And also, if you're interested in more talks like this, please do follow the center online on social media, join our mailing lists, etc. And we'll post information in the chat as well about how to do that. So without further ado, Professor Andrew MacDonald.
Thank you, Bill. That was a very kind introduction. So I'll just get right into it here. So today's talk is, as Bill mentioned, is about online privacy or people's attitudes about online privacy in China. First, I wanted to go over some details about where you can find this research. So this presentation is all on the web. You can feel free to follow along in your own web browser. You can go to bit.ly/Cambridge Privacy, and that'll take you to this web page that I'm using for the presentation. You can also follow along or take a look at some of the details. All of the code that was used to make this presentation, the working paper, the original data, all of that is available at my GitHub page. So you can follow the link here on the presentation page to my GitHub, and you can you can laugh at my bad R coding. And if you find any of it useful, please feel free to reuse it. I'm a big believer in open data, so I feel like if I talk the talk, I have to walk the walk, and everything is available here. So feel free to use it. Just remember to cite me and spell my name right when you write the citation. There's also a working paper associated with this. It should load here. So the working paper is not yet complete, but it does go into some larger discussion and some larger context about some of the results here. So if you're interested in going a little bit deeper, there's the working paper. I plan to update this, especially hopefully with some good feedback from my presentation here today, from your good questions. And in the next few weeks, this should be expanded. So if you return back, you can, in a few weeks, this will be more fleshed out. And then when it's finally fully available, I'll upload it to SSRN, and then hopefully it will also be published. But the GitHub repository will always be public and available, so you can always find the latest version there. Okay. This presentation also has a lot of specific results. So some regression, some data comparisons. And if you're interested, when you're following along, I just want to mention this at the beginning. The appendix here has all of the code used to generate all of the results in here. And in fact, it goes into some more detail than what I have time to present. So you can go a little bit deeper just directly on this web page. So you can actually run the R code in real time here. So if we go down to some of the regressions, if you're curious, you want to see like, okay, if I change the regression specification, how does that change his model? You can see here that you can click the run code button and it will generate all of the results. And then you can change the code yourself here. So let's say you want to remove age as a predictor variable, for example. You could remove it, run the code again, and then you can see here that down here at the bottom that age is dropped out of the model now. So anyway, it's a little bit trying to be a little bit interactive here. You can play around with this, and then if some specific questions come up about the data, maybe we can get into this a little bit in the Q&A. But on to the results. Okay, so why this project? Like, what's the motivating idea or the original idea of this project? And I think, a lot of people are aware, especially if those who study China, that China is a heavily surveilled state, right? Perhaps maybe the most surveilled state in the world. So, via CCTV, via less obtrusive methods, so via monitoring via apps, a lot of different technological ways that people are monitored in China by the government. And there's always been, I think, and I'll discuss this a little bit in the literature section. There's always been a little bit of discussion about the effectiveness of this monitoring, right? A lot of the research on monitoring goes into how effective is the government at controlling people's opinions or the content people see. I'm a little more interested in how people feel about this monitoring. So how do people respond to being monitored in China? Do they care? Is it something they think about? What types of monitoring do they care about? And that's really the motivation for this research project, right? Is thinking about the other side of the coin, right? So, and I'll get into this a little bit more in the theory section in a moment. But I want to also talk a little bit about like, what are the goals of this project? So what is this project trying to accomplish? And as we'll see in the theory section, it's not really clear how Chinese should expect to feel about online privacy. So there are some differing theoretical expectations about how the Chinese will respond to being monitored, right? And so I think one, that's just interesting. And two, as I think we all know, COVID was a major shock, not only to the world, but also China specifically, where in China, people were very technological means of control were used to try to prevent the spread of the virus in China, right? And very intrusive means of control. So this here is a picture of the health code that you needed to get around in Shanghai, right? This is Shanghai, but many provinces had different versions of this. And you would need to go get tested every 48 hours, or else your health code would turn red or yellow, and then you wouldn't be able to enter public places. And when you did enter a public place, you would need to have it scanned. And so the government had a record of every location that you entered, since the start of COVID. They also used cell phone, like where your cell phone pinged off of which tower to try to locate, if you were near cases. And this is all very publicly available. This is something that you would look at, every single day, check your health code, see if you've, got a yellow or heaven forbid, a red code. And so this direct experience with these technological means of control, you might expect would shift people's opinions about how they feel about being monitored online, right? So that's another goal of the project, is to explore that change during COVID. Right. So we have some theoretical expectations here about how people might feel about being monitored, right? And so the first one comes from a long line of research on authoritarian regimes. So, this is a picture here. Probably many of you have seen this movie, or at least familiar with it, called The Lives of Others. This is about a Stasi agent who spies on everyday people in East Germany in the 1980s, right? And, via this type of monitoring, or people were at least generally aware that this type of monitoring was going on, or at least suspected it in Eastern Germany. And therefore, the thinking goes that the authoritarian state directly monitoring you is something that most people would oppose, right? Because there's no benefit to it for the individual person, and there's a risk that you might say something wrong, or they might collect some information that they might use against you in the future, right? And so people would be very unhappy with being monitored by the government. Parenthetically, it turns out that actually people in Eastern Europe, the literature is a little bit uneven about, people have done studies about attitudes of people in Eastern Europe about how they feel about online privacy. And it's not actually clear that they are more concerned about online privacy than people who didn't grow up in the Eastern Bloc. But at least as a broad kind of literature, a theory from the literature, this is, I think one thing we might expect from this survey. The second expectation is one that I've heard a lot from in kind of popular press and just from talking to Chinese and also foreign people who live in China. And it's sort of based on this quote here. This is Robin Li, who is the founder of Baidu, which is the Chinese version of Google. And he said that essentially this quote here is saying that he thinks that Chinese people just don't care about their online privacy, right? That if they get something small for giving up their online privacy, they'll be willing to do it. And that, online privacy is just not really a major concern for Chinese people. And there are some explanations that go into like the possible historical reasons why this might be true, right? So you can think of, during the 1960s and 70s, there were these people's communes in rural areas in China, and then also factories, kind of urban danwei in factories in urban China, where there just wasn't much privacy, right? Just the nature of the development model didn't afford very much personal privacy. I think that this is a little bit of a straw argument. I think that even when Robin Li made this argument online, a lot of netizens, a lot of online users pushed back and said, well, actually, we don't agree with this. And I think you see some additional evidence that this probably isn't exactly true, with the fact that the Chinese government has introduced a privacy law a few years ago that in some ways is more restrictive or more provides more protection for user data than the GDPR, right? It's one of the strongest privacy measures. You'd have to ask a lawyer exactly what the details of it are. I'm not familiar with the exact, legal requirements for it, but I do know that it does provide a lot of protection for individuals' data and how it's used by corporations. So I think that this is a little bit of a straw argument, but on the other hand, you hear it enough that I think it's worth mentioning as a possible something we might find in the data. Another thing that might drive our expectations about what we find in this data is there is Chinese people trust their government a lot, much more so than outsiders might expect. So this is out of a 5-point scale. This is by this is a recent paper by Shi et al. With a bunch of co-authors, it's not unique to this paper. This result has been replicated many, many times, but this is just illustrative of one replication of this finding. So many papers have found that the Chinese, many research projects have found that the Chinese people really trust their government, right? Particularly the national government. So this is out of a 5-point scale. So, it's a, do you agree that, or do you agree that or would you agree that the national government should be trusted, right? And people on average put 4.15 out of 5 that they trust the national government. The trust is a little bit lower for lower level governments, and maybe we can discuss in the Q&A a little bit about why that is. I don't think it's central to this particular expectation, but there is this kind of hierarchical trust where the central government is highly trusted and then local governments are trusted to lesser degrees. But in comparative terms, people trust the government in China to a higher degree than any of their East Asian neighbors, right? Much higher than Japan, Korea, any of the Southeast Asian nations, and also developed countries. So China tops the world in trust in government, right? And so the Chinese trust their government a lot. This might be an alternative theoretical expectation as compared to the authoritarian literature, in that people may really trust the government to monitor them, right? The trust may, like this generalized trust in government, may flow into trust in how the government is monitoring them, right? So that's a counter expectation to maybe the authoritarian literature. And then we have the expectation, as I've kind of discussed, that COVID could possibly be a game changer, or could significantly alter the patterns of belief or patterns of attitude about how people feel about their online privacy, right? So this here is a picture of the so-called white paper revolution in Beijing in November of 2022. So this was actually kicked off by a fire in the Xinjiang city of Urumqi. I believe it was Urumqi. Somebody will correct me if I've got it wrong. But there was a fire in an apartment building, and the apartment building doors were all locked because the building was under quarantine, and then a number of people died. And this kicked off a large, although rather temporary, wave of unrest where people expressed their dissatisfaction with COVID controls, right? There was some initial thinking that maybe this protest movement would significantly alter state-society relations in China, that maybe you would get a major change in how people related to their government via this protest. And obviously we haven't really seen that in the period since, but it might indicate that people's attitudes at a base level, it may be a kind of signal, or a smoke signal where there's a bit of fire, that in fact people's attitudes about the government have changed, right? Even if it doesn't fundamentally change some of these really basic relations, it may change people's attitudes about being monitored and so on. Right. So, these theoretical expectations set the stage, or set the background to this research design. So this research project was done in 2 waves. The data collection was done in 2 waves, 2 online surveys. The first online survey was done in March 2021. So this was roughly a year after the lockdown ended in Wuhan, right? So the lockdown had been a year in the past, but perhaps still lingering in memory for those living in Wuhan. But at that time, China didn't have very strict COVID restrictions. So the picture on the right is from a famous music festival that occurred in the summer of 2020 in Wuhan. And you can see people here are crowded listening to this DJ play music. And so, life was sort of going on as normal without a lot of restrictions when the first round of the survey was launched. Fortunately for this research project, but unfortunately for the residents of Shanghai, including at the time myself, which was, a really unpleasant period, the city of Shanghai underwent a really traumatic lockdown in April and May of 2022. And then even post-lockdown in 2022, the dominant variant of the virus was Omicron, which spread much more easily than the previous variants. And so the government increasingly kind of engaged in this arms race with the virus, trying to use these technological means of control and monitoring to stop the spread of disease. So the restrictions kept building and building in terms of what you could do. Like, for example, for myself, I lived in Shanghai and my university is in the neighboring province. It's maybe only 50 or 60 kilometers away, quite an easy trip by train. But during that time period, I couldn't cross the provincial border without having to do a 7-day quarantine, right? And I would have to undergo a health check just to cross this provincial boundary, right? And so it caused a lot of inconveniences, a lot of heartache, a lot of frustration with these policies and means of control, right? Which is ultimately what led to this white paper revolution. So the idea is that by March 2023, if there were some longer-term attitudinal changes that resulted from this COVID period, they should still be visible, right? It's close enough in time that you would hopefully, if there were some longer lasting effects, that it should pick it up, but far enough away that it moves away from some of the kind of very immediate, perhaps anger at some of these controls, right? And the main idea is to compare these two to assess whether or not there was a significant change, and then pooling them together to assess some of these other theoretical expectations, right? So there is, you know, I don't want to spend a lot of time on these demographics here, but there is, between these two surveys here, zoom out a little bit, the demographics between the two surveys is fairly similar. There are some differences. It's not exactly the same. In particular, the educations, the percent that is university educated is a little bit different. About 10% more university educated in the first wave. And then also the hukou status is also a little bit different. Urban with urban hukou. Hukou means you have essentially a living permit for living in an urban area, right? And rural migrants aren't given a living permit. If they're living in an urban area, but with a rural hukou, that means that they're essentially guest workers in the city. So there are some differences here. I wouldn't classify them as large in terms of how much variation you see in online surveys, but it is worth noting. And that's part of the reason in coming into the latter half of this presentation that we'll look at a regression that attempts to control for some of these differences to make sure that the results in the simple 2001 to 2023 comparison aren't solely a result of these demographic differences. So to kind of wrap this all up, to put a bow on these expectations, we have some specific hypotheses here. So the first one is that government monitoring might lead to high citizen privacy concern if we believe that people have distrust in authoritarian regimes, right? This is kind of the classical East German story. That's the first expectation. Second expectation is that any type of monitoring would lead to low citizen privacy concern. You know, if we believe Robin Lee, if he's right, then this historical lack of privacy doesn't means people don't, just not that concerned about any kind of monitoring. We also have the possible hypothesis that government monitoring leads to low citizen privacy concerns, the opposite of H1A. And that might be the result of high level of trust in government, right? People have a lot of trust in the government, and if they're monitoring, then that's not a problem. 2021 to 2023, we might expect to see a drop in trust in government due to the COVID effects. Similarly, we might see a decrease in acceptance of government monitoring, right? That people had the direct experience of being monitored, and this made them feel really unhappy, and then now they report being less accepting of it. Finally, there might be some what's called heterogeneous effects, or some effects that vary by personality or respondent type, right? So cities that were hit hard by COVID, so that includes Shanghai, Xi'an also suffered a very serious lockdown in the winter of 2021-22, and then also the city of Wuhan, where of course the first major lockdown happened. So, and you know, there could also be some demographic variables. I don't really have strong expectations. Maybe young people may be less trusting in monitoring, but there's not a lot of theoretical priors about how we might expect, for example, age, education, income, to really modify people's feelings about their acceptance of online monitoring. Okay, so all of that throat clearing out of the way, onto the good stuff, which is the results, right? So the first result is directly looking at, are people happy with their government, right? The very foundational question here. I'm happy with the performance of the central government. I'm happy with the performance of my local government, right? Not exactly trust, but I think that a lot of these questions, you can ask them in different ways, but they all elicit fairly similar responses. And well, I'll discuss that when we get to the list experiment section. But we can see here that, and then the third question here is another version of government performance, but it's about specifically, is the government doing a good job of balancing surveillance with the right of people to kind of go about their lives. And we see here, first of all, I think the first thing worth remarking on is that the overall people are very satisfied with their government, right? So this is on a 7-point scale. People's satisfaction or agreement with the performance of the government is like 6 out of 7, which is extremely high, right? I would classify that as very high. And as previous research has found, this decreases a little bit for the local government, which isn't too surprising given what we know about how people think in China. But we do see a small, modest, I would say, and statistically significant decrease in their opinion about the performance of government from 2001 as compared to 2023, right? So, roughly a 0.2% decrease, which is, it's not nothing, but I also wouldn't classify this as a large effect either. So some modest, I guess, decrease in attitudes about government performance. But interestingly, that doesn't follow through to the question about surveillance, right? So the respondents don't seem to, when they're thinking about government performance, aren't thinking at least along the specific axis of surveillance versus freedom in reasons why they might be less happy with their government performance. So I'll circle back to that in a minute, but I want to flag that result first. Okay. So then there are a set of questions here about if people are accepting of or accept as a basic, justification the government has justified in monitoring. And so there's questions here. Questions 1 through 3 are about whether or not these specific entities have good reasons to monitor them. So central government, local government, private companies. And then the questions 4 and 5 are about the government versus private companies with respect to biometric monitoring. So fingerprints, face details, that sort of thing, whether or not it's okay for those entities to use those to monitor them. To me, this is quite an interesting result. I think this is the most interesting result out of all of the comparisons, is that actually acceptance or agreement with the statement, there are good reasons for the central government to monitor the activity of users online. There was a very large increase in people accepting that premise, right? So, and then a somewhat lesser acceptance of local government having good reasons to monitor them, and then private companies then having a still significant increase, but the least large in terms of magnitude. And my interpretation of this is that I think respondents fundamentally accept the basis of government monitoring during COVID. They may be unhappy with the actual implementation of the monitoring, right? They may be unhappy with the specific policies around COVID controls, but fundamentally they accept the government's need to impose this kind of monitoring for the public good, right? Is my interpretation of this. Happy to hear if someone else has a different interpretation in the Q&A, but I think that you can infer that from the rest of the questions that we'll cover in it, or I'll cover in a second. There was also increase in acceptance of government biometric monitoring. So, I want to step back and say that, this monitoring difference may not all, or these difference in attitudes may not be totally a result of COVID, right? COVID is obviously the largest thing, most significant thing that happened between the two waves of the survey. But, technology continues to march on, and particularly in biometric monitoring, the prevalence of biometric monitoring has only increased as time has gone on. So I don't want to, especially with biometric monitoring, I don't want to say this is all COVID, but it was a very significant and traumatic event. And I think at least acceptance of government monitoring, this large of a change, I think it's hard for me to think of any other explanation of something that would have changed that would lead to people modifying their beliefs this strongly. I think that what ties this interpretation together here is a set of questions about awareness of tracking. So that how closely do people think the government tracks their online activity, right? Central government, local government, private companies. And interestingly, there isn't much difference between these, like the average responses here, right? So they're all roughly around the same level, even in 2021, 2023. And I would interpret this as, in China, it's a little bit hard to tell who exactly is monitoring you. Like the health code I showed you in the goals of this project, this is stored, or you pull this up on Alipay or WeChat, which are the two payment apps run by private companies in China. But the data is stored on government servers, right? So it's not exactly clear, I think, even to someone who's aware and paying attention to these privacy issues, who exactly is doing the monitoring, right? It's a little hard to tell. Right, so where did we leave off? And there is a small increase in people's perception of how much they're being monitored, but I would say the magnitude is quite low. Like 0.1 on a 7-point scale, I wouldn't classify as a practically significant effect. And then, interestingly, another way of asking this question that was asked at a different point in the survey is like, I don't notice government use of technology to monitor my behavior. And people also significantly agreed with this at a higher rate, right? So people are saying they notice central government tracking more, but they also don't notice government tracking in general. I would say the magnitude on these are all pretty small, so I wouldn't read too much into any specific movement in any of these questions. What I would say, though, is that I think people generally don't notice they are being tracked very much. And the fact that, even though COVID introduced this technological means of monitoring and control, I think what the respondents are doing is that they are not pulling that to mind when they're answering this question in 2023, right? That what I think is happening is respondents are treating COVID as a one-off event. Okay, that happened in the past. That's something that was a one-off thing, that, the monitoring was painful, but anyway, that was a weird time. And now we're back to like normal times. And in normal times, the 2021 beliefs are roughly in line with the 2023 responses. The final set of questions gets at this, tries to look at the difference between people's attitudes about private companies monitoring them versus public actors, right? So, and these questions are a little bit more pointed than the previous ones. The other ones kind of just speak generally in a broad sense about monitoring. These questions are really asking, how comfortable are you with knowing your personal details, which is like a more invasive kind of question, right? Like personal details, obviously, brings to mind things you might not want to share with the government or a private corporation. I'll cover questions 4 through 6 in a minute, but just discussing those results first, we do see that, in fact, people's comfort with central government knowing their personal details is lower than their assessment of overall government performance, right? Or even their acceptance of general government monitoring. So, I don't want to say that people are completely, or the respondents to these surveys are completely, completely accepting of all government, tracking of them. There is some difference, right? Once you get into the more pointed and personal, there is somewhat less acceptance. I would still say 4.2 out of 7 is a relatively high level of acceptance of, you can imagine in Britain, how many people would be comfortable with like Rishi Sunak knowing their personal details or Donald Trump knowing their personal details. Like, you can imagine asking this question in the US context and the average would be like 2 out of 7 probably. And consistent with the other results, there's a little bit less acceptance of local government versus central government. But the big result is really that people really do not want private corporations knowing their personal details, right? And I think we can see this pattern continuing here in these other 3 questions, where one is the government is likely to securely store my online personal data better than private companies. So if any of you have ever, I don't know if anyone would trust the British government to securely store their data, the NHS to securely store their data as opposed to Google. I probably wouldn't, but I guess everyone's got different opinions. And it's especially funny in the context of China, where there are stories. For example, recently the Shanghai police, I don't remember the exact details of the story, but the upshot was the Shanghai police left a database of all their interactions with the public for a multi-year period open on the internet on a database with no password. So of course, some hackers got into it and downloaded everyone's personal ID card numbers and details about all of their interactions with the police. So, the idea that somehow the Shanghai city government the Shanghai police are going to store your data better than, Baidu or Alibaba or any of the big Chinese tech companies, to me, it really indicates like a strong trust in government, right? So similarly, a question doesn't bother me if private companies sell my user data. People strongly disagreed with that. Like that was really, respondents really did not agree with that. And a very high worry about people's payment data being stolen. That was a big concern for respondents, right? 5.6 out of a 7-point scale. Again, some statistically significant differences between the two survey waves, but I would say the magnitudes are not that large. So I wouldn't put a lot of effort into trying to interpret these too strongly. But the overall pattern says that people in China are concerned about their online privacy, right? So Robin Lee is wrong, which we already kind of knew, but it's kind of confirmation of that. Chinese people are really concerned about their privacy with respect to corporations, but it really doesn't seem to be that strongly concerned about their privacy with respect to government. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip over the list experiment results. Happy to chat about this in the Q&A. But this is sort of like another double check. So you get this problem sometimes in surveys where, especially in authoritarian regimes, where people might feel uncomfortable admitting they don't, for example, they don't trust the government, or they don't agree that the government performance is good, right? And this is called preference falsification. People lying because either it makes them psychologically uncomfortable with answering, or they're actually just worried about the government directly monitoring them, right? So, there are some survey tricks that people use to try to assess whether or not people are engaging in preference falsification. They're lying either to themselves or to the survey taker about these sensitive questions. And so list experiment is an attempt to get around that. And the results here, I'm not going to go into them in too much detail, but they are broadly in line with all the other findings that Chinese people trust their government. They feel the government has strong performance, right? I would classify these list experiments as confirming that. So it's like a kind of nice double check that these results aren't being driven by some artifact of the survey process. Okay, so on to the advanced results. So these use regressions, right, which attempt to control for or account for some of the demographic factors or other individual characteristics that might be driving their attitudes, right? So there's a set of variables here, or a set of questions here that are used as the dependent variable. The performance questions, and also the good reason for monitoring questions. And there isn't a strong pattern here in these results, so I'm not going to cover all of these. You can, if you're following along, you can pull down this drop-down menu here and focus on specific sections. I will say for the age variable, so this is just focusing in on this. These results are still including all of the other controls, but just focusing on each specific predictor variable. We can see that age. The age is positively associated with people feeling like there's good reasons for governments to monitor. So the older people get, the more they're accepting of this monitoring, which fits the white paper revolution story a little bit. The size of the coefficient is not that large, so I don't want to lean too heavily into this, but it does sort of fit that story, right? And younger people tend to be more trusting or more likely to agree that there are good reasons for private companies to monitor their activity, right? Again, size of the coefficient, not that big, but an interesting result. The demographics here, I would say nothing particularly interesting. The location, you might think that the big cities had the strongest crackdowns. Doesn't seem to be a strong pattern in location about people's attitudes, right? So doesn't seem to be a major factor here. And then in the year section, we can see that, in fact, even controlling for all of these variables, so these demographic characteristics, the results are still essentially exactly the same. The size of the coefficients almost exactly is just the direct means comparison. So we can say that even though there are some demographic differences between the two, by using the regression, we can see that actually the size of the difference in means is almost exactly the same, even when we control for things like education, hukou status, that sort of thing. And in fact, the year 2023 is associated with less trust in the government and more acceptance of being monitored, right? So again, I would interpret this as people being overall unhappy with the government's performance during COVID, but not especially concerned about government monitoring per se, right? Or at least technological means of monitoring. If I had to guess, it would probably be more likely they're upset with the specific COVID policies, like the lockdowns, the restrictions on movement, not so much the means of enforcing those particular policies. Okay, so the same regression idea, but looking at questions about tracking and data use, right? So again, how comfortable are you questions, and how closely do you think you're being monitored? Again, not a lot that's interesting in the demographic sections here, just scrolling through. I would say that the big finding here is really, the only thing that's really struck me as interesting is the not being a party member made people feel less comfortable with the government knowing about, well, all entities knowing about their personal data. So, it's a little hard to suss out what the causal factor is there. It could be some, third factor, such as people who are party members are just kind of more trusting of institutions in general, right? This result can't really address that, but it is kind of interesting that party membership does have some consistent association with some of these questions. And again, here the year variable, the difference in means between the years is almost exactly the same as the size of the coefficient in the regression. So, with both of these regressions, I do want to say that the R squared is very low. So these are very, very low R squared, which indicates that most of the variation in responses, so how much individuals varied and how they answered these questions, was mostly not explained by the demographic variables, right? They're explained by differences in personality, perhaps, or other factors that aren't related to these demographic variables. Okay, so if we take a look at the kind of last hypothesis that maybe having some kind of differential experience with these lockdowns is important, and we see, at least in the case of Shanghai, that is true, right? So in this particular line here, so we see this is the case where if you are a person in Shanghai and you took the survey in 2023, you have much more negative, or that's associated with much less kind of central government and local government views about performance and trust, and also less acceptance of central government monitoring, right? As opposed to overall, where most of the respondents were more accepting of government monitoring after COVID. In Shanghai, actually, they were less accepting of government monitoring, as from comparing 2023 with 2021, right? So, overall, I would say that this indicates that, people in China, I'm sure some of you in this who are listening now experienced some of these lockdowns in China, or some of these controls in China, or at least, saw plenty about it on the news. And I would say that, in fact, for most people in China, I don't think that the intensity of the controls was strong enough to really dramatically change people's opinions about being monitored, right? Only in a place like Shanghai, where the lockdown was particularly particularly severe, did it really significantly change people's attitudes in the way we might expect, right? So I don't know if you want to say this is a pessimistic finding or not, but to me, it kind of indicates that you would really need a major event or series of policy changes for people to move themselves off of this trust of government, right? To have a major shift in their attitude about the government, which I think speaks to the kind of strength or the durability of that trust measure in the Chinese government. The Chinese government would have to do a lot to make people feel less trusting of it, right? So even these kind of intense COVID controls didn't really move people off of their starting point. And the tracking questions I won't get into, but they're a little bit less interesting. But happy to chat about them in Q&A if you're interested. Right, so kind of summing up here, kind of getting to the end here. I know I've been talking for a long time, and I'll give you all a chance to have your say in a second. But I think we can say that the idea of distrust in authoritarian regimes is really not the story of what's happening here. Like, this literature on authoritarian monitoring that comes out of East Germany and the Iron Curtain really doesn't seem to hold up in the case of China, right? People trust the government quite a lot, and even more so after a fairly traumatic and sort of poorly performing episode or poorly performing issue that the government didn't deliver on. You still see very high levels of belief in government performance. We also, unsurprisingly, we don't find, or this doesn't find support for the Robin Lee idea that Chinese people just don't care about privacy. It's clear they do care a lot about privacy, but mostly related to private companies. We do see that government monitoring does seem to be associated with low citizen privacy concern, right? So, which is consistent with high levels of trust in government, something that this survey found, but it's also just, consistently found in all the literature about China. 2021 to 2003 led to a very modest decrease in sort of view of government performance, which, again, is labeled trust here, but, I think they're sort of synonymous. And, the cause is unclear. This survey can't answer it, but I think we can rule out at least that people were particularly offended by the type of monitoring, right? That really doesn't seem to be the reason why people had a lower trust or view of government performance as compared to the 2021 wave. People's acceptance of government monitoring, right, because of COVID actually went up. So that means that they at least believed the kind of foundational justification for this monitoring. So I think we can reject that hypothesis. But I think that there is some heterogeneity that's worth discussing, which is, in the case of Shanghai, it really does seem like that experience was a unique enough and traumatic enough experience that it did shift people off their beliefs. Not massively, it wasn't a huge change. You can check the magnitude of the coefficient in the appendix, but it was enough that we did see some of the effects that we might have expected, considering, the literature on kind of how people view privacy attitudes in the West. So, I think the final thought about this is the white paper revolution is probably only about a specific grievance, didn't really indicate a major change in people's attitudes about the government. Again, Shanghai is the exception. In citizens, there is this variation. People in China do care about privacy, but, I think that indicates, at least in the privacy literature, it's worth thinking about, what do people expect the negative consequences of losing your privacy to be? And in China, it's very much financially motivated, it seems. Again, open to any of your suggestions about how to interpret any of this data. Very happy to hear any of your feedback or ideas for other ways to mine this data for some interesting conclusions. So I'll stop there. I've been talking for a long time, and I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a really, really stimulating and interesting talk, ranging over a lot of terrain. I should also just emphasize for everyone in the audience that this is really the first survey research of this nature that I've seen, certainly, or that I'm aware of, specifically focusing on people's attitudes around COVID. So I would have thought this is a phenomenally interesting set of things for social scientists to study in China and elsewhere. But I haven't really seen it done yet. So this is really exciting to see this set of results and this work presented today by Andrew. Let me just ask two small questions first, and then we have a couple on the Q&A tab that I'll bring up as well. I again invite everyone in the audience, please, if you have questions, do click on the Q&A tab and submit them there. It's at the bottom of your screen between the chat tab and the participants tab. If actually, I'm not sure if everyone in the webinar can see those, but it's at the bottom of the screen. My first two questions that I'll ask, one is very technical and small. The other is kind of broader, more theoretical and even speculative. So the technical question is, one thing I noticed is that the results were largely presented as sort of means, and the differences in means in these distributions of respondents in the 2021 wave and the 2023 wave. And one thing that really stood out to me is that, yes, there were changes in the means, some of which I imagine were statistically significant. I mean, I think the ones marked in red, right? Because there actually the t-test result or the F or chi-squared, but I take your word for that. But what I also noticed is that the standard deviation increased by quite a lot in almost all the cases. There was one, and I think it was trust in central government, the standard deviation actually got smaller. And so what I'm wondering is, from a technical side, is that simply because the N is much larger in the 2023 wave, do you think? Or could it be that people's opinions are actually becoming more polarized, right? That the variance is spreading more, and that the range of answers are spreading, and more people are either very happy about monitoring or really upset about it, because it seems that it's the kind of issue that might tend to polarize opinions more. So that's the technical question. And the bigger kind of theoretical question has to do with sort of acclimatization and tipping points. So maybe the relationship between increased monitoring and people's acceptance of it is not strictly linear. Maybe it's curvilinear, and maybe there's a tipping point. And so at the beginning of this, right, if you start with zero monitoring and zero and low acceptance, right, and the more monitoring people become accustomed to, the more they accept it, until it passes some point where it becomes unbearable or really unpleasant to the vast majority of people, and they start to accept less and less of it. So could it be that for most people around different parts of China, they didn't reach that point, but in a place like Shanghai, they passed it? And we could think of that then as applied to other things too, right? If you know that the Stasi are literally behind the wall in your bedroom, maybe you don't like that, but you're okay with Google monitoring everything on your phone in the US when you're walking around, because it's not as intrusive, or you don't feel it's as intrusive. And it hasn't quite passed that point. I don't know. I'm just curious. So I'll leave you to those two questions, and then I'll look at the Q&A for the audience questions as well.
Sure. I mean, those are great questions. Yeah, really interesting, because, especially the thoughts on the second one is really, interesting to think about. With respect to the variance, I think that there probably is more, just as a sort of technical matter, when all the results are bunched up towards, like, when it's like, almost 6 out of 7, you just don't get much variation because everyone marks 7, right? And very few people mark 6 and lower. So it just like naturally gets a little bit more spread out when you move away from kind of one of the endpoints. But I think you're probably right that there is probably some of the experience may be differential, like, heterogeneous. As I was discussing in the regression results, like, it doesn't seem like there isn't a obvious demographic predictor variable that would explain some of that. Some people kind of snapped and this really bothered them, and some people were just like, I'm just as okay with this before as I am now. So, trying to figure out like what those type of people are, I think is something I want to do, maybe in a follow-up survey, or try to dig a little bit deeper in the data. But I think you're very prescient to pick that out of the data, or pick that out of the results as an interesting feature. I guess I just don't have enough of an answer to really fully discuss why that might be yet. As for the tipping point, I guess kind of related to what I was just discussing on your first point, it could well be curvilinear. I think that's certainly possible. I think both in intensity of monitoring and also duration. So, the Shanghai experience is obviously very intense, but overall the duration across China was really, the monitoring was from roughly, say, March 2022 until December 2022. But, if this was like, for example, Eastern Germany, where you were monitored for your entire life, maybe even a moderate level of monitoring might start to bother you after a while, right? It would be interesting to think about this in the case of Xinjiang, and maybe that's something I should look at breaking out, is, Xinjiang has a very intense monitoring environment, right? Even for people who are not Uyghur, right? Even just the Han people living there have to show their ID at a lot of checkpoints, and it's extremely heavily monitored there. So maybe that might be an interesting thing to look at as well. And I think you're probably right. There is like in Shanghai, I think they hit a breaking point. But I think also, there is this duration aspect that I think may also explain some of that.
Great. It's really interesting. There's a lot here already to explore in these data in all these interesting directions as well. So that I can imagine, subsequently several papers coming out of this, exploring all these different additional directions as well as the main thrust that you presented today, which is really great. So let me pose some questions from the audience. First, we have one from an audience member who asks, have you examined trust in government monitoring based on the type of data being monitored besides biometric data? For example, location data versus biometric data versus communication data, such as the content of emails, chats, or texts. If not, based on existing research, would you anticipate any meaningful differences in people's attitudes towards the monitoring of these different sorts of data?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as you can see from the survey questions that were posted on the lecture presentation, we did ask the question a few different ways, and some of them gave more specifics about the kind of things that might be monitored, like personal details, right? But not biometrics was the only thing where we asked specifically about a particular technological means of monitoring. I guess, the different, like monitoring your personal data implies a certain type of technological monitoring, but it wasn't made so explicit. I think given the trust in government that Chinese people seem to see, I don't think that you would get much of a difference. Like, I don't think that you would probably see, even in the different ways we asked about being monitored, there didn't seem to be a wide amount of variation, in how people felt about it, sort of depending on how you asked it. So, it might be interesting to ask about location tracking versus online posting versus biometrics, right? And maybe that's a good idea for a follow-up survey. Just as like my intuition, though, is probably there's not a large variation. One of the things you find in these surveys is like you think, so you're the survey, when you're designing the survey, you think like, oh, well, there's an obvious huge categorical difference between location data and posting data. But when respondents actually answering the survey, like they often don't make the kind of distinctions that you think should be really obvious. So that's my intuition, but it would be interesting to see. I mean, in a follow-up survey, that's something that definitely worth thinking about pursuing.
One thing, if I could just follow up on that, do you think that's because people just don't think about the implications of collection of different sorts of data? Because you're right, it seems intuitive to me that I would feel much less put upon by the government tracking my location.
Mhm.
Although I wouldn't like it, honestly. I don't like it. It does happen, and I don't like it. Being tracked in location, than I would about all the content of every phone call, text, or email, or other correspondence being read and analyzed and archived. Do you think people are just not thinking about it, or they're ignorant of that difference? Or do you think people really honestly believe that there isn't much difference between those things?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard to say. It'd be interesting to explore, if people if that distinction was important. Just speculating, I would think that, like, just based on my own experience and seeing these results, I think that like all of these concepts are fairly abstract for the respondents. So you can say, oh, people monitoring your post, but you're like, well, I don't post anything sensitive, so like, what does it matter to me, right? So there might be some heterogeneous effect there, where for like young people who are politically active, like location data might be a lot different than monitoring your online posts, right? For people who have direct experience with censorship in China, right, who have noticed themselves being censored, it may matter a lot, but for the large majority of respondents, I think it's a little abstract for that difference to really play out.
It may depend on where you go too. Right? If the locations that you're visiting are what's sensitive about your behavior, that may actually be more sensitive than what you're writing or saying online. So,
I mean, there was a case in, for example, Korea during COVID, where a man went to a number of gay bars, and the government published his destination list.
Wow.
So he was basically outed as being, homosexual by the government. So you can imagine people, not even doing
Wow.
politically sensitive things, but just, who have heightened levels of concern about that.
Or who just want to protect basic privacy and personal dignity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so another audience question we have here, which says, if you were invited to compare these results with quote unquote hypothetical research into the attitudes of American citizens, in what areas or where do you think there would be glaring convergence or rough sameness? I guess, where would they overlap with those attitudes of Chinese citizens, do you think?
Yeah, another good question. I think that in the US, there's just a lot less overall trust in all institutions. So government, I think we saw during COVID, the number of people who didn't want to get a vaccine in the United States was very high. And that's due, I think, one of the things that I think privacy research hasn't really fully caught up on is that I think privacy, at least trust in these different institutions, is really downstream of like generalized trust, right? So we see this in the China case, but I think you would also see it in the American case, where people's kind of generalized trust about institutions strongly informs their trust in whether or not how those institutions would use their data, right? So if you, for some reason really trusted the American government to protect your data for some, strange reason, or just generally trusted the American government, you would probably be more trusting. People, I think there were some vaccine passport apps in the United States, for example. Like I know New York used that for a while, and a few other cities.
Although those apps, you could just enter any data into them you wanted.
Yeah, the question about how securely it was stored is obviously
mm-hmm.
another issue. But I think that whether or not people trusted the government to administer that in a secure way really depended on their overall level of trust in government. So I think you would get the same direction of association of the relationship that you get in China, but I think the starting point of trust in institutions is much lower in the US than it is in China.
Okay, one more audience question. Could you speak a little bit about the possibility of response bias? In other words, not wanting to seem disappointed with one's government. You mentioned historical influences on current perceptions, such as the experience of living in communes during the 60s and 70s. What about influences of events such as the 100 Flowers campaign? Or I assume other, sort of intimidating historical precedent that would make people not want to answer the survey honestly if they didn't trust the government?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think 100 Flowers campaign is a little bit too far in the history books for it to influence people now. But I think, you could certainly think of Tiananmen or, even more recent events that reminds especially people who are not that likely to trust the government to be wary about sharing that opinion. Even the white paper revolution, a lot of those people were, in fact, I think, directly relevant to this question is that a lot of the protesters for the white paper revolution were identified by CCTV software, in addition, like mapped onto AI, CCTV cameras mapped onto AI software that use facial recognition algorithms to identify who the protesters were. And a lot of them were arrested based on this monitoring, right? So, those people directly suffered as a result of their participation in the protest because of being monitored. I would say on online surveys, though, people in China, I think one of the things that's interesting about China is that most people don't feel like they're being restricted or monitored by the government when in fact they, just factually they are. But a lot of people, like in other surveys, you see people don't ever feel like they've ever been, a lot of people report they've never been censored or they've never noticed being censored. They feel free, they report feeling free to post whatever they want online, right? Again, maybe this is a response bias, but I tend to think that it all kind of goes together in the sense that one of the reasons that I think a lot of this monitoring is accepted by a lot of Chinese people is they don't feel it personally affects them very much. Like the control doesn't affect them. And so for some small set of people who are really unhappy with the regime and have directly negative experiences of being monitored, yes, that could be true. Although, in the list experiment part, the number of people who agreed that the central government could be trusted. So let me share that again just briefly here. So you see here, this is a pretty severe question. So please count how many of the entities listed below would you trust with your online personal information, such as details about your purchase history, your browsing habits, and your social media posts, right? That's a pretty invasive set of questions about how many people, like, the kind of things that might be monitored, right? And what the list experiment does is, like, instead of reporting, okay, I trust the central government or not, don't trust it, you're just asked to report the number of these that you trust, right? So, if you trust Alibaba, your family, and the central government, you report 3 out of 5, right? But you don't have to say which ones. And so that's the way to try to get around some of this response bias. And the difference for the people who were given this kind of central government question, central government as an option to add up in their total, and those who weren't, so those who were given that option averaged about 2.8 of those 5 items that they trusted. And those who were only given 4 answered about 2.2, right? So that's roughly 65% of people. You can infer that about 65% of people agreed that they can trust the central government with their online personal information, including purchase history, browsing habits, and social media posts, right? I mean, that's, the list experiment isn't the end-all solution to preference falsification, where people lie about their survey, but it does indicate, I think, and this has been replicated in quite a few other papers, that just people online in China, their answers to these things I don't know, like, they don't seem to engage in this preference falsification very much, or not as much as you would think would be rational given the state of monitoring in China.
There's one other thing that's come up in some of the audience comments, which is, could you talk just a little bit about why it is that you found, and indeed other researchers have sort of consistently found, that the public in China tend to trust the national government more than provincial or local governments? Why is the degree of trust in government negatively correlated with your closeness to that government institution?
Yeah.
In other words,
I mean, well, as you're almost as familiar with this literature as I am, Bill. So feel free to jump in if I miss anything. But I think broadly speaking, the reason is that the central government does a good job of presenting themselves as the kind of protector of people's basic rights and interests, and that usually it's the local government who people interface with in terms of implementation, right? And so the usual story is that the local government screwed up the implementation, but the central government's overall plan was a good plan, right? Or a benevolent plan, or a plan that protected people's rights or interests. And the local government is the one who screwed it up. They were the corrupt ones who stole the money that was meant to build the highway, or snooped into people's data they weren't supposed to. And the central government's laws are were designed to protect people, and the local governments just failed to follow it, basically. And a lot of people have speculated, and I think probably correctly, that this is an intentional strategy by the central government, right? This is a key governing logic that the central government uses to sort of maintain its authority, moral authority. With respect to privacy, I think this is, I think, a good point to raise, and that this gets back to the point I was making, that people also have a hard time differentiating about who exactly is monitoring them, right? So, if you have this health code on your app, well, it's the central government who told Alipay and WeChat to set up this code, and they're the ones who provide the regulations that regulate this whole thing. But it's it's Alibaba and Tencent who actually have the code on your phone that, like, keeps track of it, but the database is stored with the local government. And so it's all kind of like, again, I think, like, differentiating this kind of stuff with respect to privacy is pushing people's abstract beliefs a little bit too far. And I think they just default back to their kind of generalized trust belief that the central government is their protector and the local government's kind of their protector, but a little bit less so.
I think that pretty much does it for the audience questions. If anyone in the audience has any further questions, please do drop them into the Q&A tab. I have one last question that I'll pose to you, and then I'll give you an opportunity to offer any remarks in closing that you want as well. My final question for you is that, like almost every online survey that I've ever run across that's been done in China, you do have a kind of undersampling of rural people, both urban residing people with rural hukou, but also especially just people in villages.
Right.
And maybe it's less important in terms of online privacy because perhaps rural people are using the internet less, although I'm not sure they are. I think that in China, especially, they're using it quite a bit.
Right.
Do you have enough data, do you think, or enough sample of rural people to talk at all or to speculate even about how these issues might cut in particular ways in rural areas rather than urban areas? Because I think there's an urban bias in all of our thinking about how people conceive of online privacy and engage in politics in China generally. But there still is a tremendous percentage of the country that is rural.
Yeah, I mean, like you're right to kind of raise this question, and in fact, the issue is even a little bit more pernicious in the terms of online survey, because you're asking people to reveal personal information on an online survey about online privacy, right? So you're already like, people who are taking the survey in some sense already have like a little bit more trust than people who refused, who opt out of the survey. There was a point in the survey, though, that gets a little bit to your question. So I didn't go into the detailed results because for the sake of time, but I think it was here. Yeah. So if we look at location here, for these questions about how comfortable are you with the central government knowing how closely do you think you're tracked, right? It seems that people feel much more tracked in big cities, which I don't think is that surprising. And that's even controlling for education and other factors, right? So there does seem to be some differentiation. Again, the size of these coefficients isn't that large, so it's not like some huge difference, but it does indicate that, at least compared to living, so if you go from small city to mid city to big city, people feel increasingly more tracked, right? And so it does seem that there is some, maybe that's just a result of COVID, because my impression, I wasn't allowed to visit any small villages during COVID times. Definitely not as a foreigner, and definitely not from Shanghai. But my impression was that the COVID controls there were much more informal than they were using technological means to enforce the COVID restrictions. Like, I think we all saw pictures or images of, local farmers essentially barricading the village. And so this idea that the experience of being technologically monitored is probably more legible and visible in larger areas, particularly big cities, but also urban cities. I think just mid-sized cities also, I think also makes some sense. So I think there is something there to that difference. It's probably worth exploring in some more detail in the paper, again, breaking it out by experience, because that was, during COVID times. I mean, just in general in China, obviously the difference in experience between urban and rural is important, but I think that was magnified during COVID times. And, I think that's something also worth exploring in the results.
Yeah, definitely. That's one thing that strikes me is that maybe informal or old-fashioned types of monitoring are more effective in rural areas, right? The so-called granny cadres and people like this.
I mean, if you know all the people who live in your village,
exactly.
then you don't need the app system, right?
Right, and you just need a few individuals willing to keep an eye on things and report the data. Right? That's good enough. You don't need the technological monitoring. And that's, I'm sure, true beyond China as well. I mean, if we thought about that in other countries, we'd probably find something similar.
Yeah.
So I don't think there are any more questions remaining. Let me just invite you to give any sort of closing remarks that you'd like, if there's anything that you want to talk a bit more about, or any issues you want to address, or just by way of closing, any remarks that you'd like to give.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I want to thank you and the Center for Geopolitics for the opportunity to give this talk. It was helpful to get the feedback, but it's always interesting to share new and exciting results. And so I was glad I had the opportunity to pass along these findings. I would say broadly, the main takeaway, I think, is that we I think trust drives a lot of public opinion, trust in various institutions or feelings, performance measures, however you want to phrase it. And I think people treat like privacy, for example, as some kind of discrete issue area, or you might imagine some other area of policy as some discrete issue area. But I think a lot of it kind of comes back to this kind of generalized trust. And I think this is true in America as well. So, if you don't focus on China, but you focus on, you're familiar with the American or Western European context, this idea that there's kind of a starting point a lot of people have in their beliefs, and that it's pretty hard to move them off these starting points, right? So you can imagine the kind of people who were opposed to vaccines in the US, and their distrust of the US government is like deeply rooted. It's not like, they watched one YouTube video about vaccines and they're like, okay, well, I totally changed my opinion about whether or not I can trust, Anthony Fauci, right? I think these kind of beliefs are fairly deeply ingrained. And even an event like COVID-19, which had a, major, life-altering effect for a lot of people in China, and also the rest of the world, but, for the study, China, didn't move people as much as we thought. So I think that these kind of deep-rooted beliefs have a stronger inertia than I think we often assume they might.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your attention and for staying with us. Also to remind everyone that this event has been recorded and the video of it should appear soon on the Center's YouTube channel. So please look for it there, along with videos of previous events. We do record almost all of our events and post the videos there to share more broadly with those who couldn't join live. But also for those joining live, if you'd like to watch it again, you can go back and do that. Thank you, Andrew, very, very much for an excellent talk and a really good discussion. And good night.
Yep. Take care.